On July 4th, 1969, in Vallejo, California, a fun night out in the car between two teenagers, Michael Mageau and Darlene Farron, turns horribly wrong when they're shot multiple times by an intruder. The murderer later calls the police, detailing the crime and revealing that he also committed another murder the previous year. 4 weeks later in San Francisco, a cartoonist named Robert Graysmith prepares his son for school and heads to work at the San Francisco Chronicle. During a board meeting, editor Templeton Peck receives a letter from the murderer. The murderer demands that part of a cipher be published on the front page by August 1st. He claims to have sent the other two parts to the editors of the Vallejo Times and the San Francisco Examiner, warning that failure to comply will result in a murder spree that night. The board discusses this while Robert quietly copies the code. Crime reporter Paul Avery is sent to confirm the Vallejo incident, and Robert is dismissed to finish his sketches. Sergeant Jack Moulinax confirms the crime, and Paul reports back. Apparently, Michael survived, Darlene didn't, and the letter's details match the police report. The Times and the Examiner agree to run the story, though not on the front page. Hyman, one of the editors, argues that the Chronicle should run it front page to avoid responsibility if more people are murdered. Robert tries to show Charles Theriot his sketches, but is dismissed by Templeton. Charles later agrees to publish the cipher on page 4. Paul jokes about who'll crack the code first, but Robert quietly says the murderer wouldn't reveal his name. However, Paul doesn't take him seriously. Meanwhile, the FBI and CIA also begin looking into the cipher. 3 days later, Paul hands Robert the cracked code solved by a history teacher, Donald Hardin, and his wife, Betty. Robert reads it fluently and begins working on the anagram left at the bottom. Templeton later shows Paul another letter from the murderer, describing the crime scene and identifying himself for the first time as the Zodiac Killer. 1.5 months later in Napa, the Zodiac strikes again. He ties up Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, a couple in the park, steals their money and car key, and stabs them repeatedly. The car is later found with an inscription of the Zodiac symbol, the date, and weapon used. Like before, he reports the crime to the police. Once again, the man survives while the woman doesn't. Seems like his M.O. Robert deciphers the anagram and shows it to Hyman and Paul. 2 weeks later, a curfew is declared across several counties. Then another murder happens. A cab driver is killed. A witness calls the police, but the murderer escapes before they arrive. San Francisco detectives Dave Toschi and his partner Bill Armstrong respond to the scene. The victim is Paul Stein, shot in the back of the head, with his wallet and keys missing. Blood, gloves, and a single 9mm casing are found. Kids who witnessed it from a nearby window say the suspect was a white male with glasses and a crew cut, wearing a dark jacket. 3 days later, the Chronicle receives another Zodiac letter, including a piece of the driver's blood-stained shirt. The murderer mocks the police for not catching him and claims they were busy racing motorcycles. Dave and Bill join the board meeting, examine the shirt, and confirm that Zodiac also takes credit for the Vallejo and Napa murders. Robert tries to speak up but is brushed off. Dave notices his comment and is shown the part of the letter where the Zodiac threatens to shoot out the tires of a school bus and murder the children as they exit. Dave orders elimination prints from the staff before bagging the letter. Paul follows him out, asking about prints from the cab, and Dave admits there's a partial, but warns it's not for publication. Robert overhears and shares his theory about the Zodiac sending a new code, but Paul shuts him down. At a meeting, Charles announces they'll run the letter with SFPD cooperation, omitting the school threat to prevent public panic. The next morning, Robert waits with his son for the school bus, but at the last minute decides to drive him himself. Hard to blame him after hearing that threat. 10 hours later in Sacramento, the letter is examined by Chief Examiner Sherwood at the Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, but Dave is kicked out of the room for asking too many questions. In the hall, Bill tells Dave they'll have to release the school bus threat. Dave feels it will be bad for them, but Bill insists it's already bad. Later that night, the news reports on the Zodiac's move to San Francisco and his threats as confirmed by the police department. 12 hours later, the chief detective updates Dave about holding a press conference. Dave admits they're expecting a break in the case soon, as they've been getting several calls all day from citizens reporting prospective suspects. At this point, every parent is worried about their children's safety. Bill makes a call to Jack, asking to set up a meeting with Michael, the survivor and only person to see Zodiac without a mask. Unfortunately, Michael has been missing since he got out of the hospital. Bill asks for the information they got from him, but Jack also wants the prints and handwriting. Jack tells him to call Captain Ken Narlow, who informs Bill that all they have are military-style boot prints, only sold at Military PX. These can't be bought without a military ID, making Bill wonder if the suspect could be military. He asks for photos of the prints, and Ken asks for the handwriting in return. Bill gets back on the phone with Jack, who tells him to also coordinate with the Solano Sheriff's Office, since the first two teens murdered last Christmas were from Solano. Two deputies arrived to report that they saw the suspect the night of the cabbie's murder, but the description at the time was of a black male, so they missed him. Bill instructs them to meet with a sketch artist to create a new composite. At the Chronicle, Robert talks to Paul about the water theory, how every attack has occurred near a body of water, but Paul doesn't think the case should be approached through typical police patterns. There have been 4 crime scenes in 4 different counties, and not a single usable fingerprint was found at the first 3 or in any of the letters. Meanwhile, Dave and Bill try to make sense of it all at the office. Still speaking with Robert, Paul notes that the first victims, David Faraday and Betty Johnson, were both murdered. But since then, Zodiac only manages to end the girls. Bill also picks up on this, and Dave notes that the victims are all couples in lovers' lanes, except for Paul Stein. Robert points this out to Paul, and Dave realizes the Zodiac is now breaking the pattern. 2 days later, Dave receives a call that someone claiming to be Zodiac phoned Oakland PD, saying he'll call into Jim Dunbar's morning show in 3 hours. He apparently wants attorney Melvin Belly to counsel him. Dave and Bill bring in Melvin, advising him to keep Zodiac talking and convince him to meet somewhere, preferably Old St. Mary's Church in Chinatown. They need him to stay on the phone for at least 15 minutes so the call can be traced. The show begins, and Zodiac calls in a few minutes later.
Roll the tape. Get the tape.
He says his real name is Sam and asks Melvin to meet him on top of the Fairmont Hotel alone. Otherwise, he'll jump.
Sam.
Melvin tries to keep the conversation going, but Sam ends the call.
Sam?
Still live, Jim admits they're not tracing the call, and Sam calls again immediately. He talks about his headaches and fear of the gas chamber. Melvin indulges him, but a sudden scream on the line startles everyone. Sam claims it's his headache and threatens to murder children. Melvin proposes meeting at the church, but Sam refuses, suggesting instead the front of the St. Vincent de Paul in Daly City at 10:30. The location is soon swarmed by police and reporters, and Melvin arrives as well. Dave plays the call for Brian, who doesn't think it's Zodiac since the voice sounds too young. Bill confirms the call was traced to a mental institution. 2.5 weeks later, the Chronicle receives another letter from Zodiac, mocking the police for the stunt he pulled. He says he's changing his pattern and includes another code along with instructions for a science experiment to build a bomb. Dave suggests contacting the army to confirm if the experiment would actually work. Meanwhile, Paul invites Robert for a drink.
We should have a drink.
At a bar, Robert explains how the code works, showing Paul a book he found titled The Zodiac Alphabet. Paul wonders what Robert wants out of all this, leaving Robert confused. Back home, Dave calls Bill about a basement referenced in the letter, noting that basements aren't common in California. Bill agrees to have Vallejo and Napa check with their city planners before ending the call. 1.5 months later, Melvin receives a letter from Zodiac, wishing him a Merry Christmas and asking for help. He admits he's struggling to hold back and may soon take his 9th and 10th victims. The letter was sent directly to Melvin's house. He contacts Dave and Bill, though he's already informed the Chronicle, feeling the public has a right to know. The letter had arrived while Melvin was away the previous week. He reveals Zodiac tried to contact him several times and spoke with his housekeeper, but didn't leave a number. Bill visits the housekeeper while Melvin tells Dave that murder might be Zodiac's form of compassion. Dave thinks it may be in his blood, or he just enjoys the attention. 2.5 months later, on Highway 132 near Modesto, California, a woman driving with her child is stopped by a stranger who tells her that her back tire isn't tight.
Right rear wheel is loose.
He helps her fix it, then drives off. She continues on, but the tire soon falls off. The man returns and offers her a ride to a service station. Left with no choice in the dark, she accepts, carrying her baby into the car. The ride turns terrifying when the man tells her he'll throw the baby out the window before killing her. Luckily, she manages to escape and flags down a passing car for help. Others also stop and question her as she cries. Thankfully, she hid the baby in the bushes in case the man returned. The story makes the newspapers, and 30 days later, Zodiac sends a series of new letters to the Chronicle. The map, coupled with the code, reveals where he has set up a bomb, and he gives a deadline of next fall to dig it up. 4 weeks later, Zodiac sends another letter, upset that people aren't adhering to his request to wear Zodiac buttons, as he stated in the previous letter. He now has a new list and threatens to start with the woman, Kathleen Johns, and her baby. Paul tells Robert that the police want to hold off on releasing the letter to observe how Zodiac reacts. So far, he has sent 4 letters in 3 months, and the latest one is the first mention of the Kathleen. Paul shows Robert the letter about Kathleen along with a newspaper article covering the story. Everything Zodiac wrote in the letter already appeared in the article, just like he previously did with a cop who was shot. Paul believes Zodiac didn't commit the act, but took credit for it, as he's in it for the publicity. Paul also explains that Zodiac stole his symbol, showing Robert a watch ad, the only place where the word Zodiac and the symbol appeared together before the letters. Zodiac claims he has murdered 13 people, but Paul notes only the first 5 are confirmed. 2.5 weeks later, the mayor of Vallejo, Florence Douglas, who's also running for governor, is seen on TV talking about catching Darlene's killer. Paul, meanwhile, discovers a piece of a bloody shirt while checking his mail at the office, which makes him paranoid.
Tell me it's not a piece of bloody shirt.
Fuck! Oh, fucking cop!
He shares this with Dave in a private meeting, and Dave points out that Paul once referred to Zodiac as a homosexual in one of his articles. Paul then asks for a gun. Later, Paul and Robert go to the gun range, where Paul practices shooting, while Robert reads an article about the threat Paul received. Paul reveals that he's been receiving leads and mentions a man in Riverside he's planning to meet that night. Robert goes on a date with a woman named Melanie and tells her about Paul's meeting. She thinks it's dangerous since it's based on an anonymous tip and could be the Zodiac, but Robert reassures her that Paul is armed. However, having second thoughts, Robert calls Paul's wife to ask if she's heard from him. Melanie goes home with Robert to wait for news, and eventually, Paul himself calls with information.
Sitting down? Yeah. You're not gonna believe this.
The next morning, the news reports that Paul has uncovered new evidence related to the only unsolved homicide in Riverside County history, a 1966 Southern California murder he believes was Zodiac's first murder. On TV, Paul says the Riverside Killer sent letters to the press that he personally had analyzed at the Office of Questioned Documents. The handwriting matched Zodiac's. Dave and Bill are upset that Paul didn't inform them first. 2 hours later in Riverside, Dave meets with the inspector, Ken, and Mel Nikolai from Justice. They review the letter and other evidence, but the inspector doubts it's Zodiac. They already have a suspect, but lack solid proof. Outside, Dave angrily confronts Paul about his actions, which have caused widespread panic. There's a possibility this might not be Zodiac. Following that, several people begin calling the station claiming to be or know the Zodiac, all providing false leads. 8 months later in Torrance, Bill interviews a man named Cheney, who claims Zodiac is Arthur Lee Allen, a former coworker fired from a school. Strangely, everything he says aligns with what Zodiac has done. Back at the office, Dave isn't fully convinced, but Bill runs a background check. They obtain handwriting samples, but the results are inconclusive. Dave also reveals Arthur was fired for inappropriate behavior with children. Later, Bill learns Arthur is ambidextrous, which might explain the handwriting inconsistencies. Dave and Bill report to the chief, who authorizes them to visit Arthur. The next day, at the rodeo, Dave, Bill, and Jack visit Arthur at work. Arthur says he has already spoken to someone from Vallejo, though he can't recall the name. Strangely, he insists on being called Lee, not Arthur.
I have their names at home if you want them.
What?
He makes
Also,
odd
that
comments,
day when I came
mentioning a
home, my
neighbor,
neighbor saw me.
bloody knives in his car, and admits he was in Southern California during the first murder. When asked about his job loss, he denies being the Zodiac, adding that he wouldn't admit it if he were. Dave notices his watch and asks to see it, noticing it's a Zodiac brand. Arthur then talks about the book, The Most Dangerous Game, which centers on the idea that man is the most dangerous. 16 hours later, the detectives visit Arthur's brother and wife, who confirms several details. His wife points out a spelling mistake in a Zodiac letter that matches one in a Christmas card Arthur once sent. Back at the office, Dave reports this. They're waiting for the wife to find the card before applying for a warrant. Later, Robert finds Paul passed out in his car and shares thoughts about the timing of the Zodiac letters. Unfortunately, the left-handed handwriting test for Arthur comes
This
back
suspect
negative.
is not your Zodiac.
Jack informs
Unless we bring
Dave
him
that they
a
couldn't get
handwriting
a
match or
warrant
some
since the
evidence.
DA doesn't think there's enough evidence. Another dead end. 1 year later, Paul writes to the Justice Department, requesting to take over the Zodiac investigation. Templeton scolds him for this and threatens to fire him.
For greener pastures.
Oh, I mean it.
On September 7th, Bill visits Arthur's sister-in-law again. She reveals they once arranged for Arthur to get help from a social worker, which he only attended twice. She saw him again recently for the first time in 9 months. She visited the social worker and asked if Arthur was capable of murder, which the worker affirms. Arthur is now attending school in Santa Rosa and lives in a trailer. A detailed call is made with the DA, and the chief, Dave, and Bill discuss all the evidence. Eventually, the DA is convinced and agrees to seek a warrant. On September 14th, Dave and Bill visit Arthur's trailer with the warrant, but he's not there. They search the place anyway and find items that align with Zodiac's.
One revolver.
However, the handwriting turns out negative from both hands,
No.
And the handwriting?
There's no match prints, no match writing. No match.
meaning Arthur isn't Zodiac. Sometime later, Dave takes a break to see a movie, but isn't prepared when it turns out to be about the Zodiac. 4 years later, Robert introduces himself to Duffy Jennings, the new Chronicle crime reporter. That evening, Bill tells Dave he's leaving the homicide division, tired of always being on call, wanting to watch his kids grow. The next day, Robert, now married to Melanie with a daughter, visits Paul, who has fallen deep into drinking. He suggests Paul write a book about Zodiac, but Paul brushes him off, saying it's been 4 years and Robert should let it go. Disappointed, Robert leaves. At home, he lies to Melanie about being at the library, which makes her suspicious. On October 11th, Robert visits Dave and takes him out to lunch to talk. He brings books on ciphers and shows Dave records he found missing from library checkouts. This implies someone deliberately removed their tracks, which piques Dave's interest. Though he can't officially discuss the case, Dave subtly tells Robert to see Ken. Robert visits Ken, who refers him to Jack. After some convincing, especially after name-dropping Dave, Jack finally takes him to the storage room to access old files. After several hours digging through boxes, Robert rushes to the Chronicle, compiling all he's discovered. He later meets Dave and shares what he's uncovered about Darlene and Zodiac. Robert believes Darlene knew the Zodiac personally and adds that Darlene's family received a call 90 minutes after her murder, just heavy breathing on the line. Dave is impressed and subtly tells Robert to meet Melvin, the only other person Zodiac has called directly. Robert visits Melvin's home the next morning, but only finds the housekeeper. She tells him Zodiac said it was his birthday during the call and that he would kill that day. Robert confirms the date Melvin traveled that Christmas and calls Dave, who refers him to Mel. Mel feels Robert is chasing the wrong lead since Zodiac didn't kill on those dates. Back home, Melanie tells Robert that Sherwood has called for a meeting and confronts him about the Chronicle article, suggesting he's writing about Zodiac. She's upset, warning that Zodiac reads the paper. Just then, Robert receives a call from a stranger who says Zodiac is obsessed with movies and records his murders. He claims his friend, Bob Vaughn, unknowingly stores film canisters for Zodiac. Before hanging up, he gives Zodiac's real name as Rick Marshall. The next morning, Robert meets Sherwood, who reveals that a man named Wallace Penny showed up at his doorstep a month earlier and identified Rick Marshall as the Zodiac. Robert shares that Penny told him the same. Apparently, Sherwood never cleared Rick's handwriting. Back home, Robert gets a call, but it's just heavy breathing. It seems he's attracted trouble. The next day, Robert visits Ken and tells him about Rick. Ken reveals Rick is actually his favorite suspect. Rick's fingerprints didn't match the one found in Stein's cab, but Ken says gloves were left at the scene, which raises doubts about the fingerprints' validity. The SFPD found a handwritten sign on Rick's window but dismissed it because it didn't match Zodiac's writing. Robert questions how they knew Rick wrote the sign, and Ken had also wondered the same. Rick was in the Navy and trained in code and worked as a projectionist in a silent film theater. To get samples of Rick's handwriting, Robert contacts Sherwood for Penny's number. He calls Penny and obtains a sample, which he gives to Sherwood. Upon close inspection, Sherwood admits it's the closest match he's ever seen, though the letter K differs. On April 25th, Dave receives a call, informing him Zodiac has sent a letter naming Dave specifically. At the station, he's shown the letter and taken aside by the chief and internal affairs officers. Later, Robert watches a news report on the letter, which accuses Dave of forging it himself. A well-known author, Maupin, even publicly claims Dave wrote the letter to generate publicity. Robert calls Dave's house, and his wife answers, revealing Dave has been demoted from homicide. The next morning, Robert approaches Dave to ask for help finding Linda, Darlene's sister. Dave angrily refuses and warns Robert to stop calling before walking away. Still, Robert doesn't stop researching. He even enlists his children to help go through files, though this begins to strain his marriage. On August 9th, Robert cracks Zodiac's final cipher and appears on TV. At home, Melanie is upset he showed his face publicly, worried Zodiac might come after him. But Robert feels she's paranoid. She wonders why he cares so much, and Robert insists he needs to know who Zodiac is. He arranges to meet Bob Vaughn, who suggests they talk at his house. There, Robert brings up The Most Dangerous Animal, a film tied to Zodiac's cryptic messages. He asks about a film canister Rick gave Bob, but Bob says Rick took it back in 1972. Robert then shows Bob a poster that Rick supposedly drew, pointing out the handwriting's resemblance to Zodiac's. But to Robert's greatest shock, Bob admits he actually drew the poster.
I do.
Uneasy, Robert suggests leaving, but Bob insists on taking him to the basement to search for the film. Downstairs, Robert hears creaking and nervously asks if Bob lives alone. Bob says yes and comments on the film's date, speculating Zodiac may have drawn inspiration from it. Frightened, Robert makes a run for it but finds the front door locked. Bob slowly unlocks it, and Robert drives home like he's being chased. He arrives to find an empty house and a note from Melanie telling him she's left with the kids. Devastated but undeterred, Robert visits Linda in jail, and she confirms that Darlene knew Lee. Robert rushes to the station to show Jack the report, but Jack dismisses it, closing their secret investigation. Over the next several weeks, Robert continues obsessively, losing his job at Chronicle. Melanie eventually visits him and drops off a package. She says the kids miss him and pleads for him to be done with it all. After Melanie leaves, Robert opens the file and finds Arthur's driver's license. He rushes over to Dave's house in the middle of the night, waking him up and making him visibly upset. But when Robert mentions Arthur's name, Dave lets him in.
Where'd you get that name?
Robert reveals that Arthur's birthday is December 18th,
On December 18th.
the same day Zodiac called Melvin at home. Dave allows him inside and admits that Arthur once sent him a letter years ago, offering to help with the investigation. The next day, they meet up again and begin reviewing everything they know about Arthur in the case. Robert walks through it step by step, recalling the dates, letters, and how Arthur lived just 50 miles from Darlene. Dave realizes that Arthur may truly be the Zodiac, but acknowledges they lack enough evidence to make a solid case. He urges Robert to finish writing his book and thanks him for everything before leaving. On December 20th, 1983 in Vallejo, Robert tracks Arthur to a hardware store and comes face to face with him. The two stare at themselves for several seconds before Robert turns and walks away. 7.5 years later, in Ontario, the book Zodiac by Robert is already a bestseller. George Bayward, who has taken over from Jack, meets with Michael Mageau at an airport. He introduces himself and shows Michael a series of photos, asking him to identify the man who shot him. Without hesitation, Michael points to Arthur, saying he is certain.
How sure are you? Pretty sure.
Even though the last time he saw him was on July 4th, 1969. Following Michael's identification, authorities schedule a meeting to charge Arthur with murder. However, Arthur suffers a fatal heart attack before this can happen. In 2002, a partial DNA profile developed from a 33-year-old Zodiac letter did not match Arthur's. Still, investigators declined to rule him out as a suspect. In 2004, the SFPD officially deactivated their Zodiac investigation. However, the case remains open in other counties where Arthur Lee Allen remains the prime and only suspect. Dave retired in 1989 and was officially cleared of accusations that he had written the Zodiac letter himself. Paul passed away in 2000. Robert now lives in San Francisco, enjoys a healthy relationship with his children, and says he hasn't received any anonymous calls since Arthur's demise.